River of the Mother of God, yeah. All right, so that's where we're starting. River of the Mother of God. So this is like Disney's Jungle Cruise, but not sort of corporate and
Sort of.
like acceptable to the workshop, you know? All right. And we got definitions and people. And then we got field trip. And if we have any time left, field skills. All right, so last week we talked about stuff like what are some principles of recreation or wilderness, specifically management. What makes it sort of clearly distinctive from regular forest resource management, even regular forest rec management. There are some pretty big differences. So that set us up to, in light of knowing those differences, what do we actually do day to day? So we're pushing towards that. All right, but first let's talk about the river of the Mother of God. So that was short, it's about 4.5 page essay. What'd you guys think?
Well, I like how he first off starts with like comparing the Southern America with the creation of Fortlandia with the tires and everything.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying, with the rubber and everything, and saying how that's the new future of destruction of everything. And he kind of goes through his supports, and he goes, the river gives us all these gifts, and he goes into detail about the river.
Yeah, let me stop you right there. So he was talking about tires.
Yeah.
Which in his time, you know, balloon rubber tires were a pretty relatively new thing, and we didn't have, until around that time, I think technologies like vulcanization, which takes super duper soft latex. I mean, this is why they call them balloon tires, because balloons are just trying to pop, right? And turns them into a much harder, longer wearing thing. Now you can get 100,000 mile tires, and if you think about that, that's pretty amazing. Like, it's flexible enough to, you know, cushion your ride, and yet durable enough to go 100,000 miles. That's like around the entire planet a couple of times at the equator. So that's a pretty big deal. Also, that was a really sort of prescient statement. So kind of a forecasting thing that turned out to be really pretty wise and insightful. Really only in the last 5 or so years have environmental scientists, really specifically environmental chemists, sat down and thought, okay, so when you buy a new fresh set of tires, you got a real thick tread on them, especially if they're big like off-road knobbies, right? That tread can be a couple of inches deep. But it comes time to replace those tires when that tread starts going away, and when you get the tires that are bald, right? Unless you're throwing racing slicks on your vehicle, you know, you got to pay attention to the tread depth. They started asking, where does that tread go? Does it like vaporize into space and it's no longer an issue? As it turns out, tire dust is extremely toxic to humans, and we're producing like hundreds of thousands of tons of it pretty much everywhere we drive, which is, at least in the United States, pretty much everywhere. So that's the kind of stuff that gets in your lungs, and your body's not adapted to handle vulcanized rubber particles, and it just sort of gets irritated and settles down in there and just keeps screwing you up for the rest of your life. There's no cure for breathing in rubber dust. So for him to say that 100 years before the rest of us are like, yeah, I wonder if that's kind of a problem, that's a pretty observant guy. So that's kind of an early flag to kind of take a fresh look at this essay and be like, okay, so what else did he get right like 95 years before a lot of other people like us had a chance to? All right, so the assignment was to find 3 things that kind of made a lot of sense to you. 3 things maybe that blew your mind out of this essay. That was one of them for me, the tire thing. And then 3 things that you either disagreed with or you had some questions about or what have you. So what kinds of kinds of things did you find in your 3 bits of maybe nuggets of wisdom out of this essay? And if you haven't read the essay, now's a good time to like pull out your phone, load up the course website, and check it out so we can have an informed conversation.
I'll go. One thing I found was interesting was the very first sentence.
Okay.
That said his desk was rejected and it literally yellowed right there until he retired. You know, the actual, like this whole thing we just read.
Yeah.
And to step with that was the one con I found about the whole paper. I love the whole paper to begin with.
Yeah.
I thought it was a kick-ass paper, especially written 100 years ago. I felt like this dude's sitting there smoking some crazy pipe or cigar, just going, you know what, dude? Like, it's a crazy recreation. I saw him over there, man. Like, this river just never flipping ended. What happened, man? Let's go check this out.
Yeah.
And the other, sorry to sidetrack off that, but what I was getting at was he stuck this thesis in the middle of the whole paper, to be honest with you. So I feel like the reason why it was rejected was, and I feel like the key, what he's trying to say is wilderness playgrounds simply represent the new need for exercising in a new direction. Have we grown old enough to realize that before it's too late? I feel like that was the whole thesis of the whole paper. And he kind of stuck it in the middle just to see how smart we were to figure it out.
So in newspaper parlance, it kind of buried the lead, right?
Right.
Usually you put like the first sentence of the news article or the news blog post or whatever. Not that anybody reads blogs anymore, but you put the most important stuff right at the front so you can scan it, and then if you're curious about the rest of it, then you can get into some of the details. That's a very specific information architecture, and he didn't follow that. So with an essay like this, there must have been some reason why he did that, because in a lot of other writings, especially in a lot of his earlier stuff, he gets right to the point at the beginning and then, takes us through the reasoning. But for this one, this is actually a pretty common format for things that advanced practitioners, high-level folks doing the thing, they'll do later in their career, right? So like when you're in your 20s, your early 30s, you're fresh out the gate into your profession, you're gunning to, make some money, get yourself established, build up your clientele, or move up the grade step system, and all of that if you're doing agency stuff. And, you don't really have, typically for most people, kind of the wisdom developed yet, the perspective. Like you're fresh on the field techniques and you're ready to go, but it takes time. In this case, it took decades for him to not just be an expert practitioner, but also to have like the ability to step back from like the day-to-day work, the groundwork of it, and be like, okay, so I got the what, the groundwork. What about the why? Beyond the knowledge, what's the wisdom going on here? So this is something we talk about in environmental interpretation, where the whole point of that particular discipline within forestry is to help, regular folks without the benefit of a forestry degree understand kind of the why of things, connect to the wisdom of things a little bit better than just like consuming more information, constantly scrolling on social media. Like we're going at deeper, more important things. And it takes a lifetime for most anybody, even luminaries like Leopold, to get there. So that's actually a pretty common thing. You'll note typically after agency guys retire, that's when they want to write a book to be like, hey, for all you young bucks coming up, this is the stuff that I've learned over a lifetime. You don't have to get to the end of your life to take advantage of this stuff. Just read this book or this essay or what have you. So keep an eye out for stuff like that. Every once in a while, one of our alums will send us an email of like, hey, I just retired from senior agency work in the Forest Service. I work in the DC office now, headquarters, and I'm putting out this newsletter. And that stuff in those newsletters, as boring as it is, and as outmoded as some of their language tends to be, like that stuff's gold, Like imagine you having somebody's lifetime of experience, loaded into your hard drive on day one, right? So that's a pretty big deal, and we try to connect you guys with that directly in like the professional development classes Zacheck teaches, right? A bunch of alums coming back and talking with us and stuff, and being like, hey, this is what you need to do to get started, but also here's some stuff that you should know, just bigger scale perspective. So this is a really big deal. I'm glad you picked up on that. All right.
Oh, so I was right?
Yeah.
Oh, fuck yeah, because I actually wrote through the whole article, went through like his thesis, it went through every paragraph he writes is supporting underneath.
Okay. Yep.
Why he supports what he says, and it kind of threw me back to like, he didn't write this, he wrote this for intellectual people, not for stupid fucks. You know, to be blunt and honest, he wrote it for basically us 100 years from now to be like, oh yeah, like there's a major fuck up coming in. You know, we're the start of it.
And we don't want to miss it. Yeah.
Please don't be the continuance of this.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I feel like that was the whole message he tried getting apart. You know, we have to still be kids at heart, like Indiana Jones. Like I feel like I don't speak for everyone in this classroom right now. Maybe not even you, but we all got into forestry because all of us still love adventure. All of us still want to go tackle something personally or see some awesome fucking sunsets, and you know.
Not be chained to a desk, right? Yeah. Exactly. So that is something. That's something that some of our alums over time have mentioned. That very commonly, kind of the career arc or trajectory is, you know, you get out there, you start doing burns on like a Forest Service burn crew, something like that, you know, hot shots or hand crew or engine crew, whatever it is, and you're out there living the life, and then 25 years in, you start looking at federal retirement and stuff like that, or at least retirement from the field, and, you know, all of a sudden you look around and you're like, man, I've been out doing forestry stuff like 0 days in the last 5 years, because you get promoted away from the field. So if that's something that's important to you, you're gonna be passing up promotions to stay in the field. And that's really important to some people. Some of the best park rangers, some of the best foresters I've ever had the privilege of knowing were the ones who said, you know what, I could make 10 grand more a year and it'd be just completely fucking miserable, right? So that's kind of an indirect thing out of this essay. This isn't an employment essay, but he's given us a clue that a lot of our folks give us of, hey, if it's important for you to work with your body as well as your mind and stuff like that, you know, you need to protect that. Like, your bosses are gonna love you guys, you're gonna get great work done, and they're gonna try to promote you. And up to an extent, that's awesome, right? Take on new responsibilities, learn new things even after you're out of school, of course. Otherwise you get pretty bored. But have the courage to look at a job offer and be like, you know what, this is awesome. It's amazing actually, but it's not right for me. And I know I could do great with this, but I'd also die inside of just a little bit, right? So, you know, take the compliment that your bosses are going to give you of, hey, I think you'd be great for this. You know, are you interested in kind of heading over to work in the district office or forest headquarters, something like that? And it's okay to say no. All right? It is okay to say no. All right. Anybody else? What? We'll come back to you as well. What did you find?
One of the things I found in here that I thought was pretty true was when he said, but when our ciphers have choked out the last vestige of the unknown places, we cannot build new ones.
Yep.
And that was during the paragraph when he was talking about, like, we can destroy roads and build highways if we need to. We can destroy houses and build apartments if we need to. But we can't, like, once we destroy our environment, we can't just build a new environment around us. We have to preserve the ones that we do have now and not destroy them.
Yeah. And two or three of those 13 principles we talked about the other week are addressing this specifically. We can't build our way to wild. We can't improve our way to the important, right? And Leopold's making a pretty compelling case here for, hey guys, this is pretty important stuff, right? Don't fuck this up, right? Don't give away the last few percent of our land mass to everything else. Like, we've already got 98%, you know, pretty well squared away, tamed, civilized, kind of neutered would be some of the language we'll see a little bit later on. Yeah.
We're just picking up what the kid said. I came up with the 3 R's. We're going for renewable, reusable, and replenish.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I feel like he was like just going off of
Yeah.
yours, like, if we use it, we have to, find many uses of it, but we have to replenish it. I feel like he was trying to get across too on that. That's what I wrote down, and he's also saying conservation too. Like, conservation is key, but we have to be responsible about it. We can't just let, the big thing is, I remember from Doc Ruffner saying, bitchin' is the correct term for him, was out east, how they don't do the burns, and there's not been burns out there for now over 200 years.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw what happened years ago with Cape Cod when it went up.
Mhm.
It burned, and it was still burning for months after the news said it stopped burning. It was still burning.
Yeah, in the 1940s, right about 80 years ago, there was one of those catastrophic fires on Mount Desert Island, surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, and just most of the island burned. And because some of the richest families in the world at that time have some of their summer homes there, they were like, hold up. We're never going to let this happen again. And so their wrong conclusion was total fire suppression on the island forever. And the Park Service now, which has taken over about half, 2/3 of the island, they're still dealing with that. But even 80 years later, you can see that forest regrowth pattern of fire suppression all across the island if you're looking for it. But it's subtle.
That's also.
And unfortunately, it's real pretty. It's real scenic.
That's how it's
So a lot of the rich folks who don't know anything about, wildland fire management, they're happy, right? And they're just stacking up for the next disaster. Now, the Park Service isn't going to let that happen. They'll do what they do at a lot of national parks and gather fuel and burn it off-site, which is ridiculous. But in a park context, you kind of got to do that sometimes, like at Grand Canyon. They cannot have a catastrophic fire around all those historic wood structures that are one of a kind. We literally cannot rebuild those structures if we lose them because we don't have the virgin timber to do it anymore. So, yeah, it's like 10 times as much work to like bundle a bunch of piles of slash and truck them off site. It's ridiculous, but that's what we got to do in a super duper non-wilderness context. Here in wilderness, right? Fire's a natural part of the regime in a lot of places, so let's do that, okay? And he's trying to hold space for us to be able to do that with the wild and the pristine approach. Yeah.
To piggy off what you said exactly, I love how he starts. He's talking about Fordlandia. I don't know if any of you guys know that in South America where they're making all the tires and stuff. That's what Ford tried doing, and he fucked up the ecosystem there badly. But on the last page, he says, there is no God but gasoline and motor is his profit, which is so true to this day, is what you said in many classes, that we're pushing the limits because we have our phones now that can track us where the fuck we go. We have these new vehicles that can ant crawl up a wall, which are actually doing more damage to the rock faces, plus as you just stated earlier with the tires.
Yep.
All that shit's burning off, we're doing more damage, and when's it gonna stop? I'm not trying to stand on a soapbox here, but it feels like this dude had nailed it a fucking 100 years ago. He nailed it.
No, I think that obviously in the start of this, he discusses like the technologies of his day
Mm-hmm.
and how those are like impacting the natural world and the subsequent wilderness areas.
Mm-hmm.
And then, even though this was 100 years ago, and those problems that he witnessed are like obviously vastly expanded and still problems, it doesn't
And
mean-
accelerated
I
in
think
some ways,
There's
yeah.
a lot of like, I feel like in our day, there's a lot of misconception that like there's like not a lot of new stuff anymore because a lot of the world's been explored. But I think the issue is that all of our new stuff isn't so much like in the terms of physical exploration type of new things. It's more so things like this.
Yeah.
And we're expanding things like this, and these are having vast impacts on our like wilderness areas. Horseshoe Bend, for example, that's one of those things where very awesome, very pretty spot, but because of how popular it got on social media, it's now like exponentially seen a mass increase in visitation because people want to go take the pictures that I took, where you,
Yeah.
you put your feet over it, and you get to bend.
Yeah,
So,
and you get 600, 700, 800 foot cliffs, and it's
Yeah.
a pretty cool photo.
And so,
But there's a cost associated with
Yeah,
that
and
to
that's-
the environment and to us. It's not a wild place. There's no sense of discovery or anything like that. It's all of the danger of that spot without the most fragile and important, I would say, of the benefits of it, right? So, yeah.
and then
All right, so let me,
oh, good.
Ian, did you have?
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
going to say, I don't know if this got brought up before I walked in, but when he's talking about, and like, what is standing still and what constitutes growth, like, that's something I've always seen as like, is it really progress or are we like moving backwards, you know? Is this new thing really better for us, or is it just like a new thing that's, in the long term, we're taking a step back?
Yeah, so there's a principle in management, and this is a management class, right? That when you start to measure certain things, you start to manage to those things to the unconscious or clumsy exclusion of other things that may be just as important or even more important, but they're harder to put a number to. And there's a lot of the most important aspects of wilderness that are hard to put a number to, like wildness.
Can't rate them 1 to 10.
Yeah, like pristine. How do we even know if we're 99% of the way there, right? Is that there's a lot of different ways you could try to put a number to it, but the problem is when you start putting a number to, let's say, we're going to measure the pristineness of this federally designated wilderness area on the Shawnee as the percentage of, ground cover that is native vegetation for the old growth type of this forest here. Let's say we get that to 99%. That's pretty good, right? We've reached pretty darn wild and natural. But what if we had to do all kinds of other stuff that's not measured to get to that 99%, which isn't natural at all, right? We had to spray down the whole place with glyphosate or something.
That's not natural, so that way we're taking away from what we're doing.
Exactly, but your measurement, your indicator's saying, oh man, we're 99% of the way there. Let's pop the champagne and call it good, right? So you got to be real careful about that, right? In this class especially, in every class that is management somewhere in the title, but especially this one, because in something like forest measurements, right, we're putting numbers to everything. And in a productive, conservation-oriented forest, that makes sense. How many board feet per which species? What's the canopy cover? What's the species composition or richness? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a million things we can measure. But we tend to start thinking in the direction of those measurements with our blinders on to the negative exclusion, to the harmful exclusion of things that are just as important or more important. So Ian's really onto something with that. All right, cool, yeah.
I'm picking off the definitions because I'm looking at the time now. I'm just tying everything what these two cats just said.
Mhm.
The regulation L22 is the management of official, like, I can't read my own handwriting. Interpacks or something. I wrote down intervals or something. Like, I'm assuming interparks.
Okay.
That's what regulation L, and then the 1915 Term Permit Act, which authorizes the permits for structures, on NSF lands. That leads to the U.S. regulations from Henry Wallace, who put out all those U's, the U2, U22, and U2A. Yeah, dude, I went deep this morning, bro. I took a couple dab hits and went down, bro.
All right.
Which covers the administration of certain areas for national forests, which they were saying and pigging off of. And to go with what Nash said, I almost called you Ash, wilderness versus land laboratory. Where's the end versus technology, which is an article by Leopold again. There's recreation value, safe health, versus wilderness health.
All right, so which one was that? That was a couple of them.
I know, dude. I hit 5 of them, bro.
Nice.
I tied all of them together. What they did, man.
All right, so for the benefit of your classmates, pick just the first one, and
Which one
let's
do
go
you
through
have
that so it's
more?
nice and clear signal for everybody.
I'll go with the Permits Act, the 1915 Permit Act, because that opened the door for everyone to go, well, I want to go on this land and do this with this type of recreation, or back then it was most popular hunting clubs who would buy off certain parts of, you know, 1,000, I'll go with Pennsylvania, cause I remember Doc Ruffin talking about it. They had like 300 or 400 acres that they needed a couple of foresters to manage, so they had to get permits to do that, to go through. Damn, dude, I should not have
All
gone
right,
down that
so
rabbit hole.
this is a pretty
See what happens when you eat
important
breakfast and do
moment.
yoga?
In 1915, we still don't have a National Park Service at all. The forest system exists, but the Forest Service still kind of coalescing as well. So what this Permit Act does in 1915 is it starts to slap arbitrary divisions and definitions onto what you can do, what you can't do on public lands, and where you can do it. So that's a big deal, right? We're starting to tie people's hands of you can do this, but you can't do that on this particular area.
But 100 yards away, you can do the opposite.
Right. And we're making these decisions before we have a park service, before we have a particularly functional and organized and ready to go Forest Service, right? We're not going to have wilderness for another 50 years.
Didn't Teddy Roosevelt though open Yellowstone though around 1920s though?
Yellowstone was created in 1872.
Man, I totally just ate an ass cheek on that one.
That's all right. A lot of national parks were designated around the time of 1910 to 1920.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, around a dozen of them.
So I'm thinking back to like forest policy. One of the things we learned about was like the Mining Act of like 67?
Dog, you're talking the wrong cat on this one.
No, I know. But it was basically, I don't know the exact year, but basically what it allowed was you could put in,
Stake
you
the
could,
claims,
you could, yeah, you could buy like federally public land
But you
at
had to
like
claim it.
X amount per acre, but you had to show that you were mining it, and then after like 5 years, you could actually take complete ownership of that like plot that you've chosen.
Yeah, to get people out there
Yeah,
and
yeah.
turn our natural capacity after things like the Louisiana Purchase, right, which was just before that act. The Gadsden Purchase, buying California from Spain, stuff like that. All that happened kind of right before that and a few after, where the federal government's paid millions of dollars, which is a lot of money back then, for lots of millions of acres, and now we got to get that money back somehow. So let's get people out there. We'll give the land away for a song, and if you go out there and develop it, you can keep it.
Yeah, because the reason why that stuck with me is it was like you bought it for like $2.50 an acre
Mhm.
for this like there was like acreage limits depending on how big of an operation you were expecting to do.
Mhm.
You had to show that you were bringing out mined resources, minerals of like any value,
Mhm.
and then
It just shows a working mind.
yeah, and then after like 5 years, you in like a continuous like you were doing it, you could just like buy it full blown and it will be yours. And the reason why it stuck with me is that a lot of those other acts, like the Homestead Act and the other acts that just like widely spread everybody out, is that the Mining Act of like 1867 is still currently active to this day, and there is no clause in it to where it accounts for like inflation. So like major corporations now still loophole
buying
that
for a song,
so
yeah.
bad that they literally just buy like federally public land for $2.50 and then mine the shit out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the mess
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's-
they
'cause
have
it's
every
still active
incentive to do
today.
that, right?
Yeah.
And they have every incentive to pay Congress to make sure that that is not
Not
shut down.
revoked or amended.
Because they're
But
making
Congress
$1 million off of it.
also generally wants to see stuff like that continued because the whole point of doing all of this is for tax revenue. Exactly, right? So slap a 5, 10, 15%, whatever it is, tax on whatever's coming out of the earth, and somebody else is generating wealth for ideally the entire country, but at least for the government, right? So that's kind of a thing. And that's going to, because it's happening not quite a century before the Wilderness Act, but 80 years before, that's going to take a lot of areas that would otherwise be wilderness and make them ineligible because they're settled and there's a whole bunch of resource extraction going on. This is still a thing with wilderness areas and wilderness study areas, which are like not quite born yet wilderness areas. I mean, what, 5-6 years ago, Bears Ears and another national monument right outside of, like, bordering the north side of the Grand Canyon. The previous administration was like, let's delist these and sell them off for mining, right? Because there's a lot of mineral wealth there. The Chinle Formation of sandstone, for example, has a bunch of yellowcake uranium ore in it. Those are strategic reserves, right? So, you know, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that wilderness was draped on top of stuff we really need to keep the Russians, or the Soviet Russians anyway, kind of in check. So that's a big deal. Arches National Park is dumped right on top of that stuff, and it was a big decision to say, you know what, if we all get annihilated through nuclear war, it's not going to matter what's a park and what isn't. So let's set aside Arches as a park and not do a bunch of strategic mining right there. Now, literally across the street is one of the largest uranium mining operations in the world. And there's a lot of places where you can just sort of ramble all throughout Rocky, Utah, but not right there. You can't. So that's a big deal.
It's a big no-no.
All right, just to wrap this up real quick, anything that surprised you or you disagreed with on the River of the Mother of God essay? Yeah.
Yeah, I think like the most important line, especially in terms of this class, is there's a few sentences. But the wilderness cannot be superimposed upon anything. The wilderness and economics are, in every ordinary sense, mutually exclusive. If the wilderness is to be perpetuated at all, it must be in areas exclusively dedicated to that purpose. That's like really like.
Yeah, so we can't bolt on wilderness. Okay.
And I think it's important because like in terms of calling it wilderness, you have to make the distinction that that area is mutually exclusive from any sort of economics view or standpoint, and that these economics views and standpoints shouldn't influence what happens with this area.
Basically what you just said. Good shit, bro. See, I love how Ford was at something different.
There you go.
That's why you did this exercise, Doc. You're a good teacher.
No, that's a good essay. I'm just hanging on for dear life. All right, any other things that you guys were surprised by or disagreed with? You don't have to buy this thing whole cloth. You're reasoning individuals, yeah.
Just to kind of close out, I don't know if you guys are following along, but it's like the third page on your phones. So it's that real skinny little one. The very last paragraph, he's talking about how greedy, as you were just talking about, and what the greed will do towards national parks. And, you know, like we need to, as I said earlier, above like the 3 R's, replenish, you know, renew and, you know, refill. I feel like he was just kind of hitting on that. Just he didn't go deeper. I feel like he should have gone deeper a little bit, but in the 1920s it wasn't as defined. You know, what they thought was natural resource was just tire, oil, I'm assuming certain trees and, you know, certain rocks to make, you know, what they needed.
Mining resources, yeah.
Right, but they didn't know the extent of, you know, the uranium, for example. Maybe they did, but they didn't realize how
They
far
did
they had to go to get it. Or
I mean, they just discovered oil, like petroleum products, not.
like 30, 40 years from that.
Yeah.
So it was just, as Nash said in the very beginning, it was untapped areas that, you know, so, I mean, this guy basically called it out.
Yeah.
And no one paid the fuck attention at all until now.
Well, a few people have, but it's easy to get drowned out by large interests with a lot of money, right?
Well,
You
people
can
call
buy
me
influence
crazy,
for sure.
especially with, we all know what happened with that dude in Selma, New York. I don't gotta say his name, so I'll get blacklisted.
All right, with that, let's head outside for our last 10 minutes, get a little bit of sunshine.
Do you want us to turn this in, or
Are
are you gonna give us a verbal grade?
Hang on to it for now. If anybody didn't get a chance to write out their comments on that, we can do that on Thursday. Yeah.
Do you want us to turn it in on paper?
Either way, paper or typed up, you can do it online. Yeah.
If I just wrote the 3 things and the 3 things and put quotes, is that good? I didn't print out like the whole.
Yeah, no, you're fine. Yeah, any format is fine. I'm not.
He's not
This
one of
class,
those
I don't want to spend a bunch of time on essays. Okay. Cool.